Margaret Lawson had lived in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Cedar Pines for over 20 years. A retired librarian in her early 70s, she spent her days tending to her flower beds, chatting with her neighbors, and enjoying the peace she had worked so hard for. That tranquility was shattered the moment she opened a letter from the Cedar Pines Homeowners Association. It was stiff and formal, printed on bright white paper with the HOA embossed logo at the top. According to the letter, she was being fined $5 for a violation of landscaping standards. Apparently, one of her rose bush had grown 2 inches past the designated garden border. She chuckled at first, thinking it was a harmless, bureaucratic error. $5? Surely this wasn't serious. Margaret even called the HOA office, expecting a friendly clarification or perhaps even a chuckle in return. Instead, she was met with a clipped voice telling her that non-payment would result in escalating penalties and possible legal action. Under the HOA's bylaws, Margaret, indignant but not intimidated, decided she'd pay the fine later that week. It wasn't about the money. It was the principle. She didn't want to encourage this kind of petty tyranny. A few days later, another letter arrived, this time more aggressively worded and marked final warning. Margaret frowned. It had only been 3 days. Attached was a threat of lien placement on her home if she did not resolve the matter immediately. Her fingers trembled slightly, more in disbelief than fear. Who issues a lien over $5? What Margaret didn't know was that her case had landed on the desk of Rick Davison, the HOA's head of enforcement. Rick took his job too seriously. Former mall security with a failed application to the local police department, he saw the HOA as his domain. He had a clipboard, a radio, and a group of equally overzealous volunteersmen who liked the idea of power far more than they understood responsibility. To Rick, Margaret's non-compliance was not just a refusal to pay, it was defiance. Margaret was unaware of just how far Rick was willing to go to make a point. She didn't know that plans were already in motion to escalate this minor issue into something much more aggressive. And she certainly had no idea that her home and her safety would soon be put at risk all over a $5 fine. It was a bright Wednesday morning when Margaret decided to run a few errands, leaving her cozy house empty, or so she thought. Unbeknownst to her, her son Jake had returned home early from his rehabilitation program. After years of serving in the Special Forces, Jake was recovering from a leg injury and PTSD. His visits were rare, but always welcome. He had arrived late the night before and was asleep in the guest room, his duffel bag barely unpacked. Margaret, assuming he'd show up the next day, didn't mention her short trip to the store. At the same time, Rick Davison stood just outside her front gate with 3 members of his so-called HOA compliance team. They wore black tactical vests, radio earpieces, and utility belts with flashlights, zip ties, and clipboards. Rick had even taken the liberty of putting a silver HOA enforcement badge on his chest, a prop he had ordered online. With Margaret out, he figured this was the perfect time to show the neighborhood that defiance would not go unanswered. The justification was flimsy at best. Rick claimed they were performing an emergency compliance inspection under Section 9.4 of the HOA Charter, an obscure clause written decades ago and never once enforced. It gave them no real authority to enter anyone's home, but Rick didn't care. He wanted to prove a point. They bypassed the lock using a master key Rick had kept from a contractor years ago and quietly pushed the front door open. The team entered. With caution, not out of legality, but out of fear they might be caught. The living room was still, only the soft hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. They began snapping pictures of the interior, pretending to document violations that didn't exist. Upstairs, Jake stirred. Years of combat had trained him to wake at the faintest sign of trouble. The soft creak of a floorboard below triggered his instincts instantly. He grabbed the metal cane leaning beside his bed and moved quietly toward the hallway, alert and focused. Something felt off. This wasn't his mother. He peered down the staircase and saw unfamiliar figures rifling through drawers and opening doors. His heart pounded not from fear, but from clarity. These weren't burglars. They were amateurs pretending to be something they weren't, and they had just picked the wrong house on the wrong day. Jake descended the stairs with slow, deliberate steps, his training kicking in like muscle memory. He gripped the cane in one hand but moved with more control than his injury should have allowed. From the shadows of the stairwell, he got a clearer look. 4 men, all in black vests, each with HOA enforcement printed in bold letters across the back. One was digging through the kitchen drawer, another was snapping photos of the living room, and Rick stood near the fireplace inspecting a framed picture. "Put that down." Jake's voice cut through the silence like a knife. The men froze. Rick turned sharply, startled, but quickly tried to regain control. "This is official HOA business," he barked, puffing out his chest. "You're interfering with an authorized inspection." Jake stepped into view, his broad frame casting a shadow across the room. "You're in my mother's house without her permission and without a warrant. That's called breaking and entering." Rick tried to mask his uncertainty. "We have the right to enter under the compliance clause of—" "No, you don't," Jake interrupted, his voice cold and level. "HOA rules aren't law. And even if they were, you sure as hell don't enforce them with fake badges and trespassing." One of the men reached for his radio, but Jake had already moved closer. His eyes locked onto the group, assessing them like he had done 1,000 times in hostile territory. "I suggest you leave. Now." Rick, clearly flustered but too proud to back down, stepped forward. "You threatening us?" Jake smirked. "I don't make threats. I call the police," which I just did. As if on cue, sirens echoed in the distance. Rick's bravado deflated instantly. One of his men muttered, "We need to go," but Rick hesitated, glaring at Jake like a man realizing he'd just picked a fight with the wrong enemy. They turned to leave, but not before Jake calmly snapped photos of each of their faces. "For the record," he said, "you broke into a veteran's home, impersonated law enforcement, and got caught." Rick didn't respond. He just stormed out, the others trailing behind. Jake locked the door behind them and limped to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and waited for the real cops to arrive. For the first time in months, he felt completely clear-headed. This wasn't a war zone, but the enemy had just made a big mistake. The flashing red and blue lights lit up the quiet street minutes later. 2 squad cars pulled up to the curb, and uniformed officers stepped out already, briefed by dispatch on a possible home invasion. Jake met them at the door, calm and composed, his military bearing unmistakable. He welcomed them in, showed them the broken lock, and then replayed the security footage on his mother's living room monitor. The officers watched closely as the self-styled HOA enforcers casually entered the home, searched rooms, and rifled through drawers without any legal cause. The senior officer's face hardened. "They said they were with the HOA?" he asked. Jake nodded. "No warrant, no permission, just badges they bought online." It didn't take long for the officers to locate Rick and his group. They were still in the neighborhood, trying to spin the situation to other residents as a misunderstanding. That narrative collapsed the moment the police confronted them with video evidence and witness testimony. Rick blustered, claimed he had authority under HOA bylaws, and even accused Jake of threatening them with violence. But Jake had already anticipated that. He handed over the footage, showed them the timestamps, and calmly stated, "I never laid a hand on them." I didn't have to. By the end of the day, Rick and two of his associates were in cuffs, charged with trespassing, impersonating law enforcement, and unlawful entry. The third member, realizing the situation was spiraling beyond repair, cooperated fully with the police and confirmed Jake's account in writing. The story made local news within 24 hours. Veteran foils illegal HOA break-in flashed across headlines, accompanied by images of the faux enforcers in handcuffs and Jake's calm but firm statement to the press. Authority doesn't come from a clipboard and a vest, it comes from the law. Residents of Cedar Pines were furious. A petition to dissolve the current HOA board gained hundreds of signatures overnight. Margaret received dozens of apology letters and fresh flowers from neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years. As for Rick, he was removed from his position and faced civil suits from several residents. The HOA was forced to update its policies, and oversight was handed to an external management company. Margaret, finally at peace, returned to tending her roses. Jake stayed another few weeks, helping with repairs and enjoying the quiet. When asked about the incident, he simply shrugged and said, "All that over $5. Unreal."